want to start by using a quote that we hear very often in the content industry these days. And it's essentially this quote that content wants to be free. We hear this quote being spoken very often in the context of content, but we don't necessarily understand what exactly this means. And the reason for that is that free has two different connotations. Free could be free as in freedom, or free as in free lunch. And the challenge or the tension in the content industry today is because we have two factions. One that believes that content should be free as in free lunch, in the sense that you should not need to pay for content. And the other that tries to regulate this faction using by putting constraints to content and essentially attacking content's freedom. And the reason I believe this is important is because this tension has not resolved itself in the last 20 years. We heard about how 1996 onwards, since the commercialization of the World Wide Web, we've been seeing content take on different kinds of forms and upend existing business models. And back then, when if you take one of the first significant forces, external forces on the content industry, if you think of Napster, Napster again had these two groups working around it. One was the Napster users, the users who wanted content for free and who just loved the fact that they did not have to rely on recording industries and pay for songs they did not want and wanted to use Napster as a result. And the other group was the one litigating these users and putting on digital rights management and other kinds of factors that prevented the free flow of content. But one of the first principles upon which we need to understand digital content, one of the most basic and immutable principles, is that post the internet, post the World Wide Web, content has become digitized, dematerialized, and divorced from the physical media that it used to be tied to. Prior to this event, music used to be tied to CDs and to audio cassettes, and now music flows freely on the internet. If you use Spotify, that is free flow of music. Prior to that, Napster, Kazaa were all free flows of music. News used to be tied to paper, and now news flows freely. Television used to be tied to broadcast and then to coaxial cables, and now that flows freely through Netflix. So the idea that content, when it becomes digitized, has to flow freely is one of the first principles of how to understand the content industry. And so any solution to the future of how content is regulated, how artists are compensated, needs to factor in this basic idea that if you do not account for the flow of content, and if you do not create new value capture models around free flow of content, you're kind of working against a basic law of how digital media works. It's a little like working against a basic law of nature. So the key idea that I want to tease out today is that content wants to be free, yes, as long as we're talking about free as in free flow, in the sense that you do not want to create new barriers to the flow of content. But at the same time, we need to identify new monetization models, new value capture models that try to not just monetize the content itself, but also the larger value created by content. Because in a world that is connected and where users are constantly consuming content, where you can capture data about how they're using this content, there are many more ways of monetizing this content beyond just the content and the intellectual property surrounding the content itself. So with that in mind, I just want to talk about the last 20, 25 years that have kind of brought us to this point. Ever since the web was commercialized and ever since we had digitization come into the content industry, we've seen 4 phases of transformation that has brought us to where we are today in terms of how the content industry works. And I just want to lay out a framework for that because that helps us understand where we are today and what we need to think about in terms of the content industry today. Now, this essentially is how I see the evolution of the content industry over the last 20 years. We've seen this evolution, and I'll explain this shortly, but we've seen this evolution in the publishing industry. We've seen it first in the music industry, in the news industry, and also with video and television. So essentially, the idea of this framework is that prior to digitization of content, the dominant model of monetizing content was to create a bundle that minimized the costs of distribution and amortize the costs of production across a larger volume of content. So if one song became popular and you ended up with a one-hit wonder, you still wanted all the other songs of the artist to sell. And the best way to do that was to create a bundle called the album. The album was then tied to a cassette, or it was tied to a CD, and it was pushed out. So the traditional model of monetizing content, of distributing content, was driven by the idea of a bundle. And that is because the cost of distribution and of taking content out to users was not zero. There was a marginal cost associated with distributing content because it was the cost of carrying the physical good that was carrying this content. What happened as a result of the internet, as a result of digitization, was that content became divorced from this media and was now able to move freely. And so we entered the second phase where content could be distributed at near zero marginal costs. And that meant that it could be packaged in new ways. It could be unbundled from the traditional bundle that used to exist. Once content could start moving at near zero marginal costs and new technologies came in that allowed people to create content at much lower costs, we started seeing new supply, new kinds of people coming in and creating this content. And eventually that led to a scenario where content production exploded to such an extent that you needed someone to curate this content and to help consumers decide what was good and what was worth consuming. So let me take a few examples, because I talked about this at a generic abstract level. But think of the music industry. The music industry in phase one used to work on the basis of albums. Albums were the bundle that were tied into a cassette or a CD and pushed out and distributed. With digitization, we saw Napster and Kazaa coming in. And essentially, it was a new distribution model, which created new demand. For the first time, you could satisfy demand for individual songs, not for albums per se. Fast forward a few years further, with the increasing dominance of Apple, Apple created a whole range of tools for musicians to create and record music, and started democratizing the mechanisms by which anyone could be a creator. So they created new supply, and then they tied it to the iTunes store, where if you were a musician, you could sell in a unit of one song. And during this time, there was an explosion of content, because of which eventually we started seeing Spotify and Pandora kind of coming up as curators of content, where content from different sources comes together, and you have different mechanisms by which you can filter out what you want to listen to and benefit from the recommendations of a company like Spotify. We saw the same thing happen in news, where the traditional newspaper, if you think of New York Times back in the 80s, or if you think of any Indian newspaper, the Telegraph or the Times of India back in the 80s, it was a very bundled, heavily bundled newspaper, in the sense that the same product contained all kinds of news, from sports to business to classifieds. And what happened with digitization was that we started seeing new players who unbundled news into different verticals. And Yahoo and AOL were the dominant players in this phase, where they unbundled news, and you had AOL coming up with many different channels of news, because the cost of distributing news was so low that you did not need a bundle to have it distributed. In the third phase, we started seeing companies like Huffington Post, TripAdvisor, out here Zomato, coming up with new kinds of content, which were user-generated content, amassing this user-generated content to help the readers make better decisions. And today, the large part of the news industry gets its distribution on platforms like Google and Facebook. Because as content exploded, and as we reached a point where it was no longer just the traditional producers of content who could create news, but literally anybody with access to the internet, we needed a way to organize it. And Google did that using algorithms, and Facebook did that using our recommendations. So we've seen the same model work out with the news industry. We've seen the same thing work out in the TV industry, where initially we had bundled channels, again, everything being shown on the same channel. When cable television came in, especially to India in the 90s, channels got unbundled, and so you did not just have one channel carrying all content. You had individual channels like CNN carrying news, ESPN carrying sports. And from there, we moved on to new supply, because everyone was armed with a smartphone, and we could start creating our own content, which is why today we have platforms that organize all of this content, like YouTube or Netflix, and take it to the user. So we've kind of seen this whole story again and again, where when content was digitized, it was unbundled. Initially, we saw an explosion of distribution. Then we saw an explosion of new forms of content being created. And because there are a vast number of connected consumers today and a vast number of suppliers and producers of this content, creators of this content, the most powerful position that companies occupy today are the companies that organize this market of creators and consumers and create a platform that determines which content should be shown to which consumer. In the news industry, it's Google and Facebook, which is where we are starting to see problems of fake news coming in. In television and video, it's YouTube and Netflix. In music, it's Spotify. And in all these cases, we see the platform as the central organizer of the new digital content market. And that is why the idea of platforms is so important. When I talk about platforms, a platform has this generic structure where the platform creates a mechanism for the creator and consumer to plug in and allows the content to be created by the creator on the platform and to be served to the right consumer on the platform. So think of YouTube, that's a classic example. YouTube connects creators of video with consumers of video and provides the basic infrastructure for connecting these two sides. What makes YouTube so powerful and what makes most platforms so powerful is that they have a set of control points because of which they are able to control the rest of the content market. The first such control point is that these platforms have unique understanding of the users. They have tons of data, whether it's Facebook understanding our data using our newsfeed, or whether it's YouTube understanding what we're seeing, or whether it's Netflix determining how engaged we are with a particular kind of content. All of these platforms benefit from consumer data that we create every time we consume content on these platforms. Because these platforms have the best consumer data, they are also able to create the best recommendation systems. And in a world, in a content market where there is absolutely no constraint on how much content can be created, and there's an ever-increasing consumption because of the amount of access people have, because of the improvements in connectivity, which allow streaming of increasingly higher forms of content. Because we are in this kind of a market, the owner of the recommendation system becomes most powerful. So consumers use platforms because they are recommended the best content or the most relevant or the most engaging content. And as a result of this, creators want to come to platforms because that is where the most engaged consumers exist. These two control points, the understanding of the consumer and the recommendation system, make these platforms extremely powerful. A third thing that makes platforms very powerful is that platforms, once they've created this market, they start creating a lock-in. They create a proprietary mechanism by which you cannot leave the platform. A great example of this is Amazon. Amazon initially connected publishers to readers as a retailer. But once it had this huge base of consumers who were buying books on Amazon, and on the basis of that, it could determine who was interested in what kind of books, Amazon then created a proprietary standard called the Kindle publishing platform, where essentially if you published your book for the Kindle, it was usable only on Amazon as a platform. If you had to publish it somewhere else, you had to republish it. The cost of distribution of a Kindle book onto another platform was non-zero. It had to be republished and it had to be created again. And because the consumer base and the engagement on Amazon was the maximum, this lock-in helped to lock in creators even further and move them away from any form of competitors. So the third thing that platforms do is once they've got the recommendation right, once they've got the data of the consumer right, they start creating this kind of lock-in. And we'll talk about how Netflix and Spotify are also doing that. And this is where the fourth thing becomes important, that once platforms have really good data about consumers, they know more about what kind of content works than the content industry itself. And that is when platforms start moving into production. And this is what's happening with Netflix right now, where it's moving into production because it has immense amounts of data. I'll talk about that shortly, about how consumers are consuming and hence can inform what kinds of content are most profitable with Netflix consumers. The same thing is happening with Spotify. Spotify has been heavily reliant on the labels, but as recently as a month or so back, they've opened up direct upload for independent artists who are not associated with a label. with the eventual goal of Spotify eventually becoming a label, because Spotify understands what we're listening to, and hence it will be able to best determine which kind of independent artists are likely to get huge uptake on the platform and which ones are not. So these are the things because of which a platform becomes increasingly powerful as the market around the platform uses the platform more and more. Now, to understand platforms, it's also important to understand why platforms scale so rapidly. Because if you look at companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Spotify, and Netflix, they are now, some of them are the world's most valuable companies. They're part of the world's 10 to 20 most valuable companies. Most of them are less than 20 years old. Some of them are less than 10 years old. And they've got to this level of value in such a short period of time. And the reason for that is that platforms do certain things that are very different from the way traditional media companies used to work. The first is that platforms have a network effect, which means that as more consumers consume content, the platform gets more data and becomes more powerful, so more creators want to come to the platform. As more creators come, there is more content to be consumed, and so even more consumers come. And this self-reinforcing cycle sets in where more creators attract more consumers, and more consumers attract more creators in turn, because of which a platform ends up becoming a winner-take-all in a market. So if you look at Facebook and Google, in their respective markets, they've kind of become a winner-take-all. You see the same thing with YouTube, for example. The other thing that happens is that as platforms gather more and more data, they start benefiting from artificial intelligence because they are able to train their algorithms on all of this data. We heard this morning about how AI could change the way the value chain, the content production value chain works. And that's entirely possible, and it's already happening with companies like Netflix and Amazon, where they're using a lot of data to inform their production, and over time have the potential to make more of their production intelligent and more of it increasingly automated further up in the creative process. So a combination of the fact that they have network effects and the whole market comes to a platform, and the fact that they gather all of this data and hence benefit from artificial intelligence, makes platforms very successful. But the third and most important thing that very few people understand about platforms is that platforms win largely because they work on very different economics. And a lot of platforms win because they benefit from cross-subsidization. Let's take an example. If you think of the telecom industry, out here in India, companies like Airtel, BSNL invested tons of money in setting up the infrastructure for the telecom industry. And the eventual goal was that once this infrastructure was set up, these companies would make money on SMS, because the marginal cost of transferring an SMS is very low, but you can charge a significant amount for that, and then you make money off the traffic. And we ended up, around this time that this should really have gone off and become big, we ended up with companies like WhatsApp coming in and providing that value for free. And the problem is that the telecom companies cannot compete with that, because the telecom companies were hoping that SMS would subsidize the investment in infrastructure, whereas WhatsApp is subsidized by the advertising business that Facebook has. And so WhatsApp benefits from this cross-subsidization. The same thing is happening in many other industries. If you look at Amazon right now, Amazon is getting into content production, but it never needs to monetize that content because it owns all of the retail inventory in the world, and it keeps on increasing the access to retail inventory. If it can determine, and it already has the mechanisms to determine what kind of products are being shown inside a movie at a particular point in time, what kind of products are being mentioned in certain songs, it can directly connect consumers to those merchandise and relevant products, and benefit not from monetizing content, but monetizing the sale of the products that the content promotes. And in that way, Amazon has an advantage that Netflix does not have, because Netflix has to continue monetizing content. Amazon can acquire content at below cost. It can give it up completely for free, and yet be a highly profitable business because it cross-sells on its e-commerce marketplace. And this is the reason platforms are so successful, because they constantly use cross-subsidization and cross-selling and compete with business models that cannot afford to do that. And that's what makes platforms incredibly successful. And we'll keep coming back to this point, because when we think about platforms coming into the creative industries, there are certain things about platforms which are just difficult to compete with, because traditional creative companies may not have that kind of, those kinds of economics or that kind of a business model in the first place. But when we think about these platforms coming in, what's the impact that they have on the traditional creative companies? This is how I think about the impact. Traditionally, platforms, before platforms came in, the creative industry used to work in that model where you had creators and then you had intermediaries, which were recording labels, book publishing companies, and then you had consumers on the other side. Now, platforms have impacted these industries in two ways. In some industries, platforms came in and completely removed the intermediary, or even if they did not completely remove it, they took away most of the profits from the intermediary, which is what we see in Model B. That's what happened in publishing, for example. When Amazon came in, it initially came in as a retailer between publishers and users, and eventually became a publisher itself with Kindle Publishing. And it was able to do that because the value that these intermediaries were creating were not entirely in sync with the amount of value that they were capturing from the transaction in between in some cases. And so authors were increasingly moved towards Kindle Publishing and started publishing over there. It was also able to do that because platforms benefit from the long tail. So a whole range of authors who would never have been published through a traditional publishing house were able to get to a market through the platform. And while individual authors may or may not be discovered, the platform always wins because every time an author gets discovered, all of those transactions then flow through the platform. So because of this, Amazon was able to a large extent, commoditize the traditional publishing industry and take away a lot of their revenue models. We saw this happening in game publishing and apps publishing as well. And in all of these cases, the fact that the platform charged only 20 to 30% of the transaction versus the traditional companies charging a much higher rate played a big role. We also saw a different model, which is what I think of as Model C, in the music industry and to a certain extent, to a large extent in films, where the traditional intermediary was not removed, but the platform created a better way of distributing the traditional intermediaries' content. And so in the music industry, Spotify still works with the labels. In the movie industry, Netflix still works with the studios. But what we see in these cases is that as the platform gains more and more information, it is now moving back and becoming an intermediary so that eventually the long-term goal is to move from the Model C to Model B in these industries as well. And the reason it plays out like this is because both music and movies are heavy investment industries where somebody has to take the risk and take on a new artist, take on a new production, and take it to market. When a platform first starts, it does not have the information to take that risk. So it allows the creative houses to take that risk. But as it starts gaining data, this is exactly what Netflix did, and this is what Spotify is doing right now. As the platform gains data, it is able to better determine which risks are worth taking and which risks are not worth taking, and eventually becomes a label or the recording house or a studio itself because it is able to do that with a much higher success rate. And this is what we're going to see increasingly in the music and the film industry. So if you think of the impact on the traditional intermediaries, it's been either platforms eating their lunch right away or forming a partnership where they will eventually eat their lunch in the long run. And we've started to see that with Netflix and Spotify, the way they are headed. But to a large extent, when we think of it from the creator's perspective, there are mixed reactions. Some creators feel that platforms have been not so good because they lose a lot of money, and platforms are not really doing anything about that. They lose a lot of potential revenue. Platforms are not tracking it. But there's also a widely accepted notion that to a large extent, platforms have also had some level of positive impact because it's democratized access. Creators can directly connect with their audience and are able to not just get access to a market, but also build a following. We have the example of T-Series out here, for example, which is now the world's second most followed YouTube channel, possibly could end up being the world's most followed YouTube channel. And that's an example of a platform like YouTube creating value for a traditional creative company, which would not have happened in the past, where in the past they would just have sold content, but would not necessarily have created this interaction with fans who wanted to subscribe to that content. So there is a lot of value created in the fact that platforms democratize access to the market. They allow creators to have interactions with their fans. In fact, some of the creators who use platforms best do not just use a single platform. Some of these creators have huge followings on YouTube where they put out their content, but they also have followings on Twitter and Instagram where they engage directly with fans. They also use crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter where they bring in their fans from these other platforms to fund their next projects. And these are the creators who are playing in the platform economy with its rules and benefiting to a large extent. So if you look at what's happened with platforms, there's been a fair range of a fair degree of positive value that has been created because of platforms coming into the market. But there's a second side to platforms as well, which we think about a lot, and I want to talk about and highlight especially two aspects of it. The fact is that as a platform grows and becomes bigger and starts gaining more and more power, it starts making decisions which are not good for the ecosystem. And there are two ways of thinking about it. The first is that when a platform scales up and when a platform becomes really big, the fundamental idea of a platform business model is that you take the resources of the ecosystem and you benefit from the rewards coming out of those resources, but you put all the risk back to the ecosystem. Platforms are a form of neo-colonization, if you will, where you take the resources from the whole ecosystem and put the risks back and to the ecosystem, and you benefit from everybody who's succeeding or failing on the platform without taking any of the risks. So if you look at a platform like YouTube, it constantly benefits from all the content that is being shown on the platform, but does not necessarily give a lot of value back from the advertising revenues to the creators. Does not necessarily take a lot of efforts to prevent piracy on the platform. So what we see is that because platforms have such a huge negotiating power with their creative communities as they scale, over time they start making decisions that work against these communities. The reason this happens is obviously because platforms are open forms of market creation where they allow creators to come in and participate, but at the end of the day, they are owned by a few companies. And the systemic issue with this is that when platforms are small, they need a funding mechanism, and at that point, some investors come in who eventually make those decisions in the long run. So if you really think of solving this issue of sharing the risk and rewards with the ecosystem well, if we really want to solve it at a large scale and sustainably, we need an alternate funding mechanism to start. The second thing that happens with platforms is that just like the funding mechanism creates this tension between the owners of the platform and the creators, the monetization mechanism of platforms often creates a tension between the actual output that the creative industry should create and the kind of output that it ends up creating. So take Facebook as an example, and this is very timely in today's world because Facebook's monetization is entirely based on making you click on links. To click on links, you need to stay engaged. And to stay engaged, you need to see content that is edgy, that provokes you, that makes you interact with the platform. And so over time, being entirely data-driven and mathematically oriented about how they solve this problem, Facebook has ended up optimizing for maximizing our clicks on the platform, which knowingly or unknowingly translates to showing us increasingly edgier content. The Wall Street Journal did an investigation on YouTube where they saw that YouTube's recommendation algorithms have been tweaked over time to a point where once you start seeing a certain kind of content, they show you increasingly more polarizing content around that. And this is something that is called three degrees to Alex Jones, which is a running meme that no matter where you start on YouTube, within 3 clicks, you end up at this video by a guy called Alex Jones who justified a mass shooting in a school in the US, which essentially means that the investigation uncovered that every time you interact with YouTube, you are being driven towards more polarizing content, which then impacts creators, because if consumers respond better to polarizing content, then creators create polarizing content, and that's why we've seen the rise of the right-wing media, we've seen the rise of fake news, huge Macedonian industry set up around clicking fake news on the internet. And all of that comes down to the fact that Facebook makes money because it makes you click. And you click when you see polarizing content. And that peters up all the way back to the entire value chain of content production. So if you look at all of the issues with platforms today, fundamentally it comes down to money. How are platforms funded? If platforms are funded by a few venture capitalists and are owned by a few central people and one company, then over time, as they grow bigger, they start making decisions which work against the ecosystem. How do platforms make money? If platforms make money by making you click on content that may or may not be true, then they will do more of that. And so eventually, what is fundamentally wrong about the way the platform economy is structured today is not the fact that they are replacing traditional intermediaries. It's not the fact that they are taking away the old ways in which content was monetized, but the fact that the way they make money and the way they are funded works against the long-term creative output of the ecosystem. There are other factors that are impacting the creative value chain today, which are incredibly important to understand. One of those factors is that platforms are reducing risk-taking appetite in the traditional creative industries. And that is, again, because platforms, as I mentioned, do not take any risk themselves. They leave the rest of the creative industry to take that risk. And while the creative industry takes that risk, platforms learn from the data of what's working and eventually get into production at a point where they don't have to take that risk anymore. And that's exactly what Netflix did. But there are other ways in which platforms also reduce the risk-taking appetite over time in the industry. Think of Amazon. In the US, it's been shown in a whole range of studies that as Amazon started charging increasingly, started forcing publishers to charge increasingly low costs for the books that they were selling through Amazon, the publishers' margins started reducing. And a lot of publishers have their own internal cross-subsidization model, where essentially they use a few bestsellers to subsidize all of the risks they take on new authors. And because of what Amazon has been doing, since the margins of publishers have been going down, the ability to take these risks on new authors with these publishers has gone down as well. Combined with that is the fact that as Amazon becomes larger, publishers have become more consolidated, especially in the US, where from hundreds of publishers, there are 3 or 4 major publishers that continue to remain after this consolidation. And because of these two factors, the fact that publishers become consolidated but also dependent on Amazon, and the fact that they cannot subsidize new risky titles because of the lower margin that they now have, the risk-taking appetite in the publishing industry has been going down as a result of what Amazon has been doing with its pricing. So there are ways in which some of these issues around the second-order effects of platforms do not show up directly. We see the issues around piracy, we see the issues around intellectual property protection, but there are a lot of second-order issues that come up when you think about platforms. Let's talk about Netflix, because Netflix has a whole history to it as well, and it's impacted the creative industry in many different ways. So when Netflix started in the early 2000s, Netflix was a breath of fresh air for the creative industry, and that's because prior to Netflix, Blockbuster was the dominant mechanism for distributing home video. So if you released a film, you could distribute it on the big screen, but then Blockbuster in the US was the dominant mechanism for distributing home video. The way Blockbuster worked was that every store of Blockbuster would serve local demand. So if there was a store in a certain part of the city, most people coming in and taking a movie would be from that part of the city itself. And Blockbuster essentially stocked the most salient, as the name suggests, they would stock the blockbuster movies, the big movies that had a lot of demand. And because of that, Blockbuster was not focused on promoting independent film creators as such, because it did not make sense to get license to a certain movie and just have it lying as idle inventory. So Blockbuster created these many different stores which would satisfy local demand. Netflix came up as an online video on demand through rental over mail order. And a lot of people thought that what really distinguished Netflix, what was really powerful about Netflix, was the fact that it was digital and that anybody could have access to it and that they did not need to have stores. That was part of the story, but Blockbuster also then started going digital. The one thing that prevented Blockbuster from ever competing with Netflix was a simple change in their supply chain that Blockbuster was never able to copy. Every other feature on the front end was easy to be copied, but the supply chain that Netflix had could not be copied. And here's how it worked. Netflix came up with this idea that you could queue movies that you wanted to get next. So it created this feature where if you were interested in certain movies, you would start queuing it up. And at the back end, all of this information would get consolidated, and Netflix would have this real-time map of which movies were required in which part of the country at what point in time. Because of which it created a national supply chain. It did not have to buy the same movie and stock it at all of its outlets the way Blockbuster had to. It could buy a much smaller number of movies and satisfy local demand using all of this data on where the movie would next be required. So the cost of acquiring titles for Blockbuster was much higher. The cost for Netflix was much lower. And even though Blockbuster copied queuing, it copied all of the front end, it was never able to change its supply chain, which was the real secret sauce behind Netflix. Now, what happened as a result of this, coming back to the impact on the creative industry, was that initially, Netflix had a huge positive impact on the creative industry. Because it was expensive to acquire the blockbusters and the big titles all the time. So Netflix created a recommendation algorithm where, depending on what movies you saw, it would recommend you obscure movies which were cheap to acquire, but still interesting to watch. And through this recommendation algorithm, it created an entirely new market where independent movie makers could bring in their movies to Netflix at a low price and could get access to a market for the first time when big box studios and when big movie houses would not take a risk on these independent creators. So the net impact on Netflix in the pre-streaming era was very positive on the creative industries. But as we enter the streaming era, Netflix started benefiting from a whole range of data that it could not have captured in the past. Now Netflix knows how long you see a particular sequence, at what point you pause, at what point you abandon a certain movie, how many seasons down you go before you abandon a certain series. And it uses all of this information along with the fact that it can benefit from computer vision and know what's happening in a movie at any particular point in time. It uses all of this information to determine what kinds of content, which kinds of actors, what kinds of plot lines work best with the audience. And once it's learned all of this from movies that it's acquired from outside, it's now gone into content production. And over time, as we've already seen with Netflix, this data-driven content production has been so successful that they're able to keep investing and keep getting more and more into content production. Over time, because they determine what consumers want to see, and they own the recommendation system, they can start moving more and more consumers to the content that they create versus the content that the rest of the creative community creates. So Netflix is not just a player that has an increasing amount of threat on the initial part of the value chain further up towards production, but it's also increasingly getting an iron grip on the consumption side, because it's been demonstrated repeatedly that people tend to crave content that is available rather than just content that they want to see. Because if you keep on seeing the same set of recommendations repeatedly, if all your friends are also seeing Netflix, the value of the content being shown on Netflix becomes much higher than the value of content that it does not carry, which gives it immense negotiating power. And if you think of these are the kinds of issues that countries in Africa are now thinking about. When Netflix has started entering African countries, all of these countries are concerned about the impact on the local creators, because Netflix has all the information it requires to create the most relevant content without even requiring local creators to participate. And that, in the long run, could commoditize the local creators as Netflix enters in and starts gaining more access and starts even changing the taste that consumers have in that country. So as we note through all these examples of Facebook, Google, Amazon, Netflix, YouTube, there are two levels at which impact is happening. The first level is that these platforms take all the rewards from the ecosystem, but radiate all the risks to the creators. But the second order impact is that the fundamental way in which the value chain works, the fundamental assumptions that go into what kind of content will succeed versus not, the fundamental economics of creating content is being changed because of the way these platforms work. So where does this leave us in terms of solutions? I just want to close on this note by thinking about what does this mean in terms of solutions. When we think about systemic solutions to playing in the platform economy, we need to think from all three aspects, from the perspective of what creators should do, what should platforms be doing, what should the next generation of platforms look like, and how should regulators think about regulating the platform economy. When we think about creators, I want to come back to where I started. Content wants to be free, which essentially means that creators need to think about content not just in terms of IP that should be protected and should be constrained, but also IP that should just serve as a mechanism for spread and creating awareness and creating a following and creating other forms of value. And the other thing that creators need to think about is not just the value of monetizing content directly, but the value that can be created by content through the spillovers in other forms of monetization. As I explained with the Amazon example, where Amazon could potentially build a huge content business without ever monetizing the content and still be hugely profitable. So let's talk about the first thing. In today's world, when users are increasingly connected, creators need to think about how to use certain kinds of content for spread and how to monetize certain other kinds of content. And this is not a model that is entirely new for the creative industry. Before I started looking at platforms, I used to be a semi-professional musician, and around that time, we as a band, we tried to figure out different ways in which we could monetize content. And one of the most compelling models in the pre-internet era was the Grateful Dead model. Grateful Dead is a band in the US, and essentially what they used to do is they would give all of their content around bootlegs and gig rehearsals and backstage rehearsals, all of that content for free to users so that that content would spread. And then the consumers of this content would then come back to live concerts by Grateful Dead and buy the tickets. And so they became especially successful using this model of thinking about content for spread, even in the pre-internet era, versus content that should be monetized. This has become even more important today. One of the best examples of a creator who did this very effectively is a New York Times bestselling author called Tim Ferriss. So Tim Ferriss wrote these books, The 4-Hour Body, The 4-Hour Week, and The 4-Hour Chef. And with his first few books, went to the New York Times bestseller list. And when the third book was supposed to come out, Amazon Publishing took rights to that book, because of which Barnes & Noble refused to carry that book. So essentially, Tim Ferriss had to figure out how to create a big bang launch without relying on the traditional intermediaries. And in an example of how to embrace the pirates, Tim Ferriss struck a deal with BitTorrent, where essentially BitTorrent has millions of consumers downloading the pirated content, and Tim Ferriss essentially took a part of this content, the first chapter of the book, several interviews, all kinds of multimedia surrounding the book, and created a BitTorrent bundle that could be downloaded by every user of BitTorrent globally. On the first day, he got 800,000 downloads, which was more than any traditional intermediary could have guaranteed him. And through that, within the next 2 days, hit the New York Times bestseller list with the book again. And so this is an example where the book was sold through traditional channels, but the fact that he thought about certain kinds of IP for spread and actually using a piracy site to get access to users who would then spread that content even further helped to create the awareness that was required for that content to be successful. So the first thing that creators need to think about is how can certain kinds of content be used to create spread and certain other kinds of content be used to capture value. The second thing that's important is that the Amazon model can be used by creators as well, where content could be created, but value could be monetized in some other ways. And there is real statistical data and some level of correlation studies that have shown that countries which countries from which the most comments came on K-pop videos were also countries to which the trade of consumer goods increased during the subsequent period. So the more people from a certain country interacted with videos, with K-pop videos, the more the trade from Korea to those countries of consumer goods around that kind of music increased during that period. So this is pure correlation, and somebody might say it's not causation, but essentially the point is that K-pop, the value of creating K-pop and creating spread is not just in monetizing for every single view or every time a song is played. The value of K-pop that's been generated for Korea is more in the form of the increased trade of consumer goods, merchandise that have been sold because of the memes created through K-pop. And that's something that creators need to think about in an economy where content is increasingly useful as a means of spread. Are there other ways of capturing value by allowing this content to spread for free? The third thing that's important is that even if you don't allow the content to spread for free, your competitors probably do not look like you. Your competitors, again, benefit from cross-subsidization. This is something that's increasingly happening because in today's world, everybody needs to create content, even if they're not in the content industry. So think of the Marriott group of hotels. The Marriott group of hotels has a 100-member team focused on creating content, which is larger than a lot of travel content companies have. But they don't need to monetize the content because all they need to do is provide the content for free so that people come and stay at the hotels and make money in other ways. Now, when this kind of situation comes up, your competitors may not be focused on monetizing content at all, may have better ways to create content, and in that case, the monetization of content becomes a commodity. And so it becomes important even more for creators to think about ways in which spread and monetization could work together, cross-subsidization could work, and to think about competitors who do not look exactly like them. Let's talk about this from a different perspective. When we think about this from the platform's perspective, we talked about the creator. The creator needs to think about how to best work with the natural laws of a connected world. But when we think from the platform's perspective, there's a lot that can be improved on that side as well. Because today we have companies like Google which own YouTube. YouTube has the system of content ID which can determine whether a certain video has a song by a certain artist and can accordingly create an advertisement and provide monetization back to that artist. But that content ID is far from successful today. It does not have, let's say, 100% coverage. And if you think of the fact that Google is the company that organizes all of the world's information, solving this content ID and piracy problem should be non-trivial for the company with Google's resources. And yet, we have scenarios where independent startups, there's a company called Create Music Group in California, an independent startup that just signs up artists and using its algorithms finds more instances of piracy on YouTube than Google is able to find, and then provides that value back to artists and takes a cut from that. If a startup can find all of that, a company like Google is probably not investing enough resources towards making the most out of identifying these instances of piracy, which is where I believe that when we think about platforms and the role that regulators have to play with platforms, it's important to think about how regulators can work together with platforms to manage these kinds of issues. And the reason this is important is because a lot of regulators today are focused on binary regulation. You're either allowed to do something or you're not allowed to do something. We've seen this with GDPR. We've seen this with the European copyright law, where the intent is there. Yes, a platform should be responsible for pirated content, but there is no framework around which that kind of regulation should happen. An alternate model that I think of a platform regulator relationship is something that we already see in, say, the cybersecurity industry. The cybersecurity industry also needs a lot of regulation, but it's not binary regulation. It's not that if you're not secure, you're just shut down. It's because it's very straightforward. You need systemic regulation for something like cybersecurity. So the dominant model of regulating the cybersecurity industry is to use white hat hackers, who are essentially people who test and who try to break into systems to see if it can be broken into. And given the fact that determining whether a pirated song exists on YouTube, on a YouTube video or not is a technical problem as well, an approach similar to white hat hacking, facilitated by a regulator, opening it up to academia, think tanks, opening it up to startups, could be one of the ways in which a more systemic model of regulation could come into play. So when we think about the platform regulators relationship, it's important to think about how we move beyond the binary regulation that we've been used to and think of these more systemic methods of regulation. The other thing that is important from a platform perspective is to think about how emerging technologies like blockchain could be used to create a more sustainable and a more trackable form of organization for the creative industry. The blockchain, being a decentralized mechanism, does not suffer from the challenges that platforms have, and could potentially be used to digitize the whole digital value chain, could potentially be used to digitize content production, not just the content, but the content production act itself, and using smart contracts pass back the value to specific creators based on what they have created on the blockchain. So there are other mechanisms that we need to think about going forward, whether it's blockchains, whether it's new forms of creating platforms. How can platforms become more accountable using some of the benefits that new technologies bring? The final thing that I would like to say before closing this is when we think of regulators, to think about the role of a regulator in a platform economy needs to start thinking like a platform. A lot of regulation today is very litigation-based. It's very binary in the sense that you're allowed to do this or you're not allowed to do this. It's not data-driven. What's really happening in the platform economy is that content production, which used to be an art, has become a science. It's data-driven. So regulation, which has always been so binary, can also move to a data-driven form of regulation, where essentially the regulator would require a platform to open up their data. And then, because the regulator is not the most technically savvy constituent in this whole ecosystem, the regulator would then open out this access to this data to a set of academics, think tanks, and startups who could come in and analyze this data on certain characteristics and determine whether those characteristics are actually met. The regulator's role would then be to just create the standards and essentially create this platform for regulation where the think tanks could help to run the analytics on top of this data to determine what's actually happening and whether the regulator's requirements for a successful digital market are being met. And to some extent, this is already happening in other parts of the platform economy, maybe not in content, but if you look at Airbnb entering various European countries, in Denmark and Italy, Airbnb has been sharing its data with the regulators, and the regulators have been inviting academia and think tanks to get access to this and analyze it. In the aviation industry, Airbus is planning something similar. As more and more unmanned aerial vehicles and drones start flying around, Airbus is working to create the central platform where all the data captured by these drones is mined and analyzed. So that the individual drone operators can benefit from the insights, but the government and the regulator also plugs into this platform and monitors air activity in real time. So we need this kind of a continuous metrics-based regulation where the platform in partnership, where the regulator creates a platform which, or works with a central platform creating party and has a constant view of this data and works on certain metrics that they agree on prior to this fact. As we see with all of these examples, there can be any number of litigations, and we will still not solve the problem of content wants to be free. If we have to really solve that problem, it comes down to two specific aspects. How can we use data to better understand these platforms and use that to create the right checks and balances? And more fundamentally, how can we think about platforms with alternate forms of funding, alternate forms of monetization? Because as I mentioned, a lot of the issues that come up with platforms today is because of the monetization models they use and how that impacts the creative industry further up the chain. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take more questions as we move forward, but thank you so much.